The auction yard smelled of sawdust and nervous animals, and the particular kind of confidence that comes from men who already know what they're going to buy before they arrive. Trucks lined the fence in careful rows. Voices carried across the open lot, easy and loud, the way voices do when they belong to people who aren't worried about money. He came on foot. He came late too, slipping through the gate as the morning bidding had already found its rhythm. A small and weathered figure moving between bigger men without brushing against any of them. His coat was clean, but thin. His boots had been resoled at least twice. He carried nothing in his hands except a folded slip of paper and the particular stillness of a man who has thought something through a long time and arrived at a decision he intends to keep. He passed the hog pens without stopping. He walked past the calf stalls and the rack of farm tools laid out on wooden pallets. He found his way to the far end of the yard, where the light was thinner and the auctioneer's voice didn't carry quite as well, and he stopped at a long wire pen set low against the back fence. 39 rabbits. The paper tacked to the post said so, 39, and anyone could see at a glance why they hadn't moved yet. They were small-framed and loose-coated, their fur lying flat and dull, the way fur does when an animal hasn't had quite enough of anything. They sat in loose clusters, quiet, their sides moving in small, steady breaths. A few turned dark eyes toward him when he approached. Most didn't bother. He stood there a long time. He didn't tap the fence or make the clicking sounds men make to test animals. He just looked. He studied the way they breathed, the way they sat, the length of their legs, the shape of their ears, the quiet patience in how they waited without panic. He studied the pen floor and what it held. He looked at things other men wouldn't have thought to look at. Behind him, the crowd had noticed the pause. Someone said something low. There was a sound like a short laugh. The auctioneer, glad to finally move the lot, called it out with the flat tone reserved for things he didn't expect to sell. A starting price so small, it was almost an apology. No hand went up. The auctioneer tried again. Lower. Nothing. And then the old farmer raised his hand. Calm. Certain. The way you raise your hand when you're not trying to win an argument, but simply stating something true. The bidding lasted about 4 seconds. No one else joined. The laugh that followed was immediate and not unkind. The way a crowd laughs at something they've already agreed is foolish. A few men shook their heads. One said, loud enough to carry, that a man might as well set his money on fire and at least get warm from it. The old farmer paid, gathered his receipt, and began arranging for the transport of 39 rabbits nobody wanted. The road home was long and the crates were noisy. 39 rabbits in wooden slats, stacked in the bed of the old wagon, shifting their small weight with every rut and stone. They didn't carry on the way frightened animals do. They pressed their noses to the gaps and breathed the moving air and settled. By the time the wagon turned off the county road onto the dirt track that led to the farm, the evening had gone quiet, and the fields on either side were already dark at the edges. He pulled the wagon around the back of the house and stopped. The garden was there. It always had been. But calling it a garden required a kind of faith that the last few years had made difficult to justify. It was a rectangular patch of ground, maybe 40 feet long, maybe 20 wide, bordered on 3 sides by a low fence that had started to lean. The soil was pale in the last of the light, not pale the way dry soil gets after a week without rain. Pale the way soil gets when it has been dry for a long time, deeper than weather, down in its nature. The surface had cracked into a shallow map of lines, the kind of cracking that happens when the living material in the ground has nothing left to hold moisture together. Where seeds had been pressed into it in years past, nothing had taken hold long enough to matter. The rows were still faintly visible if you knew where to look. Shallow depressions, ghost marks of effort that the ground had simply refused. He stood at the edge of it for a while, with his hands loose at his sides. It was not discouraging to him, at least not in the way it might have been discouraging to someone who hadn't yet decided what the rabbits were for. He was looking at the problem the way a man looks at something he's already begun to solve, measuring the distance between where things stood and where they needed to go. He started with the hutch. He worked through the last of the light and into the early dark, moving without hurry. The wood he used was old, salvaged from a lean-to that had come down in a storm 2 winters back. He set the first posts directly beside the garden rows, sinking them with a maul, testing each one with his weight before moving to the next. The frame came together low and long, designed not for convenience, but for purpose. Positioned so that what fell from the hutch floor fell onto the garden soil below. Simple. Nothing wasted. The rabbits waited in their crates while he built. Occasional soft sound from them, the rustle of straw, a nose pressed to a crack. The night air was cool and smelled of old wood and turned earth, faint but present, that particular smell that means the ground still has some memory of life in it, even when it shows you nothing. He looked at the pale soil one more time before he went inside. He saw something in it no one else in this county would have thought to look for. He finished the hutch by morning light. The rabbits went in one by one, lifted carefully from their traveling crates, set onto the slat floor with the patience of a man who understood that frightened animals needed a moment to feel where they were. Some froze, some pressed into corners. A few nosed at the straw he had spread and began, almost immediately, to eat. He watched them settle and felt something ease in his chest that had been tight since the auction yard. He was filling the water troughs when he heard the footsteps. The neighbor came across the fence line the way a man does when he has already decided what he thinks and only wants to deliver it. He was broad-shouldered and well-fed, his boots thick-soled and clean compared to the old farmer's mud-caked work ones. He owned the 3 richest fields in the county and was known in town as a man whose opinion arrived before he did. He stopped at the garden's edge and looked at the hutch, looked at the pale, cracked earth beneath it, looked at the 39 rabbits, their dull coats, their prominent ribs, their small eyes blinking in the morning sun. He took his time. He folded his arms. "I heard you spent your last real money on those," he said. The old farmer said nothing. "I didn't believe it. Thought someone was telling it wrong." The neighbor tilted his head at the cracked soil. "That ground's been dead since before my father stopped coming over here. You know that. Everybody knows that." He paused. "Rabbits won't fix dead ground. Rabbits just eat and leave pellets and die. That's all they do." The old farmer adjusted one of the water lines along the hutch. "How many you got in there?" 39, the old farmer said simply. The neighbor made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh. It was something between them, the sound a man makes when he has decided pity is more appropriate than anger. 39 skinny rabbits on dirt that won't grow a weed. He shook his head slowly. "I'm not saying it to be cruel. I'm saying it because somebody ought to. You spent what you couldn't spend, on animals nobody wanted, for ground that's been done since before either of us had gray hair." He looked at the old farmer then, directly, the way a man does when he believes he is offering kindness. "That's not farming. That's just—" He paused, searching for it. Hope with nothing holding it up. The old farmer bent down, pressed one hand flat against the pale earth beneath the hutch and held it there for a moment. The soil was dry and cool, almost powdery at the surface. Almost. He stood up, wiped his hand against his trousers, and turned back to the rabbits. He did not answer. He did not need to. What he had felt beneath his palm was not nothing, and he had known for a long time that the land keeps its own kind of account. Each morning, before the light had fully committed to the day, he was already in the garden, not planting yet, not watering, just working. He had built the hutch rows so that the floor slats sat open above the beds, a deliberate thing, measured out with string and a level eye before he had driven the first post. During the night, the rabbits moved and shifted and did what rabbits do, and by the time he arrived each morning, the soil beneath the hutches had received its gift. Dark pellets, small and dense, scattered across the pale earth. Soiled straw, wet with use, pulled loose from the bedding trays and dropped in loose clumps along the rows. Some men would have called it a mess. He called it work. Every morning he moved along the rows with a short-handled tool, old, the handle worn smooth, where his palm always fell, turning the manure and straw into the top layer of soil. Not deep, just the top few inches. Just enough to fold it in, the way you fold something carefully into batter, wanting it to disappear, but knowing it does not disappear so much as become part of what surrounds it. He worked the length of each row and then moved to the next, and when he reached the end, he went back to the beginning, because the rabbits had already been at work again while he traveled the rows. It was a slow engine, the kind that does not announce itself. The soil still looked poor. That was the honest truth of it, and he made no attempt to think otherwise. It was pale and compacted and dry at the surface, and if a passing neighbor had looked over the fence on any given morning that first week, they would have seen an old man bent over bad dirt with a hand tool, turning rabbit droppings into the ground, and they would have had nothing new to report to anyone. But he was watching the soil more closely than that neighbor would have bothered to. He saw the way the top layer began, barely, to shift in color. Not green, not yet anything visible, just slightly less pale at the edges where the straw had settled. He saw, on the fourth morning, a single earthworm moving through a turned section near the first post, and he stood still for a moment and said nothing and moved on. On the seventh morning, he planted. He did not wait for the soil to look ready. He knew it was not ready by any standard measure, but he also knew what was already happening beneath the surface, working without permission from anyone's expectations. He pressed the cabbage seeds in first, in pairs along the first two rows. Carrots next, along the center rows where the drainage ran best. The pumpkin seeds last, set wide apart at the far end where there was the most open ground and the most sun. The soil still looked like it had never grown a thing. He pressed each seed in with his thumb, covered it gently, and moved to the next. The feed store sat at the edge of town where the county road bent south, and it was the kind of place where news traveled faster than rain. Men leaned against the counter in the mornings, bought their sacks, and talked. They talked about prices and weather, and whose fence had gone down, and whose cow had freshened late. And sometime in the third week after the auction, the old farmer's rabbits became the talk that would not leave. It was the prosperous neighbor who carried it there first. He told it the way men tell a story they enjoy, with a pause in just the right place, with a small shake of the head that says, "Can you believe it? 39 rabbits. Spent his last on them. Built some kind of hutch contraption over that dead patch of his, letting the droppings fall right into the dirt. Says he's going to grow something." The men at the counter laughed, One of them laughed so hard he set his coffee down. Another one said he'd heard of folks trying strange things, but that took a particular kind of stubbornness to commit to. A third one said, well, at least the rabbits are eating. At least something on that place is getting fed. The story spread the way these stories do, a little larger each time it moved, a little more ridiculous at each new telling. By the second week of that telling, half the town knew that the old man was farming with rabbit droppings and had nothing else to show for the spring. Some people laughed out of genuine amusement. Some laughed because it felt safe to, because the neighbor laughed first, because it cost them nothing. The old farmer's name carried a particular kind of humor now, the gentle but cutting kind that small towns reserve for people who try unlikely things. He heard about it the way a man hears most things, in a small town, second-hand, sideways, through a word dropped without much thought. Someone at the road mentioned it without malice, almost in passing, the way you mention weather. He heard it. He did not correct it. He did not explain himself, which he knew would only make for a better story. He went home and checked the hutches. He raked a section of the straw that had matted at the far end of the third row. He carried water and watched the rabbits eat, and thought about nothing in particular. But the laughter had weight. That was the truth of it, not the laughing itself. He had expected that, but the size it had grown to. A man can absorb his own doubt. It takes something different to absorb a town's. He was not young enough to pretend it didn't press on him in the quiet hours. He was not proud enough to say it didn't matter. It mattered. He simply did not allow it to move his hands in any direction other than the one he had already chosen. The soil did not care what the feed store said, and in the mornings it was the soil he answered to. The rain came in the night, quiet and unhurried, the kind that doesn't announce itself with thunder or wind, but simply arrives and stays. He heard it against the roof from his cot and lay still, listening. By morning it had stopped, and the air smelled of wet earth and something underneath the wet earth, something older and harder to name. He rose before the light had fully settled and went out in his coat and boots without eating. The garden was not what it had been. He stopped at the edge of it and looked. The change was not dramatic, not the kind of thing you could photograph or hold up for another person and say, "Here, do you see it?" It was subtler than that. The color of the soil had shifted, where the dirt had been pale and close-grained, almost chalky in dry weather. It was now a deeper shade, not black, but moving toward brown, the way old wood moves toward dark when moisture reaches it. And where the rain had pooled slightly in the low furrows, the water had not beaded and run off the way it used to. It had been taken in, the soil had held it. He walked along the first row without touching anything, just looking. Then he crouched at the middle of the second row, where the drop from the hutches had been most consistent, and he pressed 2 fingers into the earth. It gave, not easily, not like mud. It gave the way good soil gives, with resistance that yields, with structure that bends but does not collapse. He pushed his fingers in to the second knuckle and felt it. Cool, faintly damp, not packed. He pulled his hand back and looked at what came with it. Dark particles, a few small threads of straw, broken down past recognition, a crumble that held its shape for a moment before falling. He pressed his palm flat against the surface and felt the faint give of something with body to it, something that had mass and memory. He did not say anything. There was no one to say anything to. He stayed crouched for a long moment. His knees were not what they had been, and the cold of the morning was in them, But he stayed down and looked at the soil and understood what he was seeing with the plain, unhurried certainty of a man who has read this particular language his whole life. The soil was alive again, not healed, not yet, not ready. The seeds were still dormant, and the roots had not yet found anything to hold. But the ground beneath him was no longer the same ground the town had laughed at. Something had come back into it. Something that manure and straw and 39 small, steady animals and the slow revolution of days had returned to a place where it had been absent long enough that most people had stopped expecting it. He straightened slowly. He did not smile. He nodded once, the way a man nods at news he had been waiting for, but had not let himself count on. Then he went to check the water. 4 mornings after that, they came through. Not one or two, not the scattered, hesitant showing of a garden that was only half convinced of itself. They came in rows, clean even, deliberate rows, as though the soil had been waiting for exactly this moment to make its position clear. The seedlings pushed up through the dark crust of amended earth with a steadiness that made the old farmer stop walking and simply stand at the edge of the plot, looking. He had planted cabbages, carrots, and pumpkins in sections marked by nothing more than a furrow line and memory, and all 3 sections had broken through, more or less together, as though they had made some agreement below the surface about timing. He moved to the nearest row and crouched down. The seedlings were not tall, an inch, some of them, barely 2. But they were upright, and they were green, the particular bright green of something that has found what it needs and means to use it. He moved slowly along the row, studying each plant in turn, tilting his head when he found one he wanted to look at more carefully. He pressed his thumb gently beside one stalk, not touching it, just feeling the soil around its base. Moist, dark, faintly warm. The root was going down properly. He moved to the carrot section. The thread-thin shoots were nearly translucent at their tips, that pale first green of emergence, and they stood close together in the row the way he had seated them, evenly spaced, each one finding its own column of light. He counted several feet of row before straightening up. Then the pumpkins. The pumpkin seedlings were the boldest, the way they always were. The seed leaves already wide and declarative, each pair of them flat and open like small hands held up to the morning. He counted the hills. He counted the plants in each hill. He went back and counted again. Every hill had taken. He stood up and looked across the entire plot for a moment, letting himself see it whole rather than row by row. It was still a modest thing, this garden, nothing that would stop a man passing on the road. But to his eye, which knew what this ground had been, the difference was not modest at all. The difference was the difference between a stopped clock and one that is running. He went directly to the hutch after that. He did not stop to eat or to sit. He went straight to where the straw was stored, and he began adding it in, deepening the bedding on every level of the hutch system, packing it thick and fresh beneath the 39 rabbits, who accepted this with their usual composure. More straw meant more absorption. More absorption meant more breakdown. More breakdown meant more of what was moving down through that soil in a slow, rich current that was still only beginning. He worked methodically, section by section, without hurry, but without pause. The seedlings stood in their rows behind him, bright and even, catching the morning. He was on his knees at the far end of the 3rd row when he heard the footsteps on the road. Not hurried footsteps, the slow, proprietorial kind that belonged to a man who considers the land around him an extension of his own judgment. He did not look up immediately. He finished pressing the loose soil around the base of a seedling that had leaned slightly in the night wind, setting it straight, and only then did he sit back on his heels and glance toward the fence. The neighbor had stopped walking. He was standing at the fence line with one thick hand resting on the top rail, looking across the garden rows with an expression that had not yet settled into anything recognizable. His mouth was slightly open, not in wonder, more the way a man looks when he has stepped onto ground he expected to be solid and felt it shift unexpectedly beneath him. His eyes moved along the rows, counting without meaning to count, tracking the green lines that ran straight and even from the near end of the plot to the far. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said it wouldn't last. He said the soil out here couldn't hold seedlings past a certain point, that anyone who had farmed this county long enough knew it. He said the plants would bolt in the heat or yellow out before midsummer, that you could get a thing started in bad ground if conditions were right, but you couldn't keep it going. He said all of this while looking at the rows rather than at the old farmer, and his voice had a quality to it that was different from the easy laughter of auction day. It was the voice of a man constructing something quickly, building a roof against weather that had surprised him. He walked away faster than he had arrived. The old farmer watched him go. He did not call after him, did not straighten up with satisfaction, or allow himself any visible change of expression. He simply watched until the figure had rounded the bend in the road and disappeared behind the hedgerow. And then he turned back to his work. But the log knew what the farmer did not yet fully know, or perhaps had not yet let himself think directly. The man had stopped. That was the thing. A man who feels secure in his certainty does not stop. He glances, maybe. He waves a hand, walks on, spends no more energy on what he has, already dismissed, but the neighbor had stopped at that fence and stood there long enough to feel the need to explain, to himself as much as to anyone, why what he was seeing did not mean what it appeared to mean. The doubt was there. It had arrived before the explanation had, and the explanation was built in a hurry. The rows kept growing in their slow, steady way, indifferent to the conversation that had just taken place beside them. The soil beneath held its quiet, and the 39 rabbits shifted in the hutch above it, and the morning continued. That evening, when the light came low and orange through the gaps in the fence slats, and the air had cooled enough to make the work pleasant, he made his rounds. He did this every evening. It was not a chore he rushed or abbreviated. He moved along the hutch row with a tin pail in one hand and a bundle of fresh straw tucked under his arm, pausing at each section, checking the water crocks first, refilling where the level had dropped, tapping the wood to loosen any straw that had packed itself against a corner. Small things, methodical things, the kind of attention that has no audience and expects none. The rabbits moved around him with a familiarity they had not had in early spring. Then they had pressed to the far end of whatever space they occupied, ears laid flat, bodies tense and uncertain, in the way of animals that have not been handled gently or often. They had been at the auction long enough to know that sudden hands meant something unpleasant. They had learned wariness before they had learned much else. But that was months ago. A full season of the same slow, quiet routine had changed what they expected from an approaching figure. He lifted one, a mid-sized doe with a coat that had come in thick and tawny over the summer. Nothing at all like the dull, roughed-up fur she had worn at auction. She sat in his hands without protest, and he ran a palm along her back, feeling the muscle beneath. the good solid weight of her. Her eyes were clear and dark. Her ribs, which he had been able to count easily in the first weeks, had long since disappeared beneath the flesh of an animal being properly fed and properly kept. He set her down and moved on. They were almost unrecognizable, all 39 of them. He had not thought about it in those exact terms while it was happening, because it had happened the way all good changes happen on a farm, in increments too small to notice on any given day, visible only when enough days had accumulated to make the difference undeniable. But standing in the low evening light, with the smell of clean straw rising around him, he could see it plainly. They had come to him half-starved and skittish and written off. They had been fed and watered and bedded and checked, evening after evening without exception, and they had become what they were always capable of becoming. The same thought that had belonged to the rabbits in the spring could be laid just as honestly over the rows of growing things below the hutch. He pulled the old straw from the nearest section and replaced it with fresh, letting the soiled bedding fall through the wire floor to the garden bed beneath, the way it fell every evening, the way it had always fallen, unhurried and steady and certain as anything he had ever known. Late summer came in heavy and golden, the way it does when a season has been working quietly all along, and finally has nothing left to hide. He walked the rows in the early morning and understood, without needing to say it aloud, that something had shifted from growing into grown. The cabbages sat low and swollen, their outer leaves spread wide as open hands, their heads dense and tight and green as river water in shade. He had planted them from seed in soil that had not fed anything in years, and now the largest of them were the size of buckets, heavy enough that lifting one required both arms and a moment to find his balance. He set one on the ground beside the path and stood looking at it the way a man looks at something he believed in for a long time before anyone else would. The carrots were deeper than his tools could reach without resistance. He had to loosen the soil all the way around each one before it would come free, and when it did, it came up long and straight and orange to the very tip, with no hollowness at the center, no splitting along the sides. Several of them bent slightly under their own weight when he held them, out level. He had never grown a carrot like that in his life. He was not entirely sure he had ever seen one. The pumpkins were the last thing, and they were the most obvious. They had been swelling for weeks with the quiet insistence of something that does not need to announce itself, and by late summer they sat at the base of every mound like round boulders, their skins deepening from pale to gold to a hard burnished orange. Some of them were larger than he had expected any of his seeds to produce. All of them were sound. He was tying back a cabbage leaf that had begun to fold when he heard a cart slow on the road that ran along the edge of his property. A woman stepped down with a ledger book tucked under one arm and introduced herself as being with the county extension office. She had been passing, she said, and had stopped because she could see the garden from the road. She asked what he had put in the soil. He told her plainly, rabbit manure, soiled straw bedding, water, and thyme. Nothing purchased, nothing added from outside. 39 rabbits in a hutch above the rows, every day since early spring. She wrote it down. She wrote for longer than he expected, and when she looked up, her expression was not the one people had been wearing since April. It was the expression of someone recalculating. She thanked him and drove on. That evening at the feed store, and then at the church steps, and then somewhere along the road that ran to the prosperous neighbor's gate, The conversation about the old man's garden changed Register entirely. The laughter had gone out of it. He loaded the cart before first light. The pumpkins went in on the bottom. They had to, given their weight, and even then the cart sat lower on its axle than he had ever seen it. The cabbages were stacked with care, each one dense and firm and pale green in the lantern light, the outer leaves still cool with the night. The carrots he bundled in dozens, bound with strips of cloth, their shoulders broad and their tips straight and clean. When the cart was full, he stood back and looked at it for a long moment. Then he went inside, washed his face, put on his good coat, and drove toward town. The market road was quiet that early, and the fields on either side sat still in the gray morning. He could hear the horse breathing and the slow creak of the cart, and nothing else. He had no way of knowing what the day would bring. He had not let himself wonder too much about that. He arrived and took his usual place at the end of the row. By the time the first buyers came through with their baskets and their lists, several of them had already slowed before they reached his stall, drawn by the size of what they could see from a distance. A woman lifted a pumpkin with 2 hands and could not quite close her fingers around it. A man set a cabbage on the scale and watched the needle swing past what it usually touched and keep going. Someone asked the price of carrots, and when he told them, they bought 4 bundles without hesitation. The crowd built. It was not the loud, hurrying kind of crowd that comes for a spectacle. It was the quieter kind, people pressing in close, turning things over in their hands, asking honest questions. He answered each one the same way he had answered the woman from the county office. Rabbit manure, soiled straw bedding, water, and time. 39 rabbits, all spring and all summer. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. At some point he looked up and saw the prosperous neighbor standing at the far edge of the gathering. The man had not come to his stall. He had no basket, and he was buying nothing. He was simply watching. His arms were at his sides, and his expression was the expression of a man who had believed himself to be certain, and was now very quietly discovering that he had not been. The old farmer held his gaze for only a moment. Then he turned back to the woman in front of him, who was asking whether he would have more pumpkins the following week. By mid-morning, the cart was half empty. By midday, there was nothing left to sell. People were still arriving when he folded his cloth and set the empty scale on the seat beside him. The word had already moved through town faster than he had. He loaded the empty cart slowly, not because he was tired, though he was, but because he wanted to feel the weight of what was not there anymore. The cart that had bent low under pumpkins and cabbages and carrots, that morning rode easy now, light as a dry leaf, and he stood beside it for a moment before climbing up and letting the old horse find its own pace home. He stopped at the bank first. The man behind the counter counted what he handed over and made a mark in the ledger and looked up once, briefly, as if he meant to say something, but didn't. The old farmer waited until the receipt was in his hand, then folded it into his front pocket and walked out into the afternoon light. The second stop was a short walk down the road to a low wooden building where a deed had been sitting in a file drawer for longer than most people in town could remember. The plot of land next door to his own. The scraggly, thin-soiled corner lot that the county had stopped trying to sell years ago because no one believed anything useful could come from it. He paid what they asked. It was not a large sum. They seemed almost surprised that he wanted it at all. He did not explain what he intended to do with it. He drove home in the long quiet of late afternoon, the horse steady, the road soft with dust. When he turned through his gate, the first thing he heard was the sound of the rabbits moving in their pen, small shuffling sounds, the dry scratch of paws on straw. He climbed down from the cart and went to them before he did anything else. 39 of them, all present, all unhurried, all exactly what they had always been. Skinny things that no one had wanted, turned into the most useful creatures on the property. He stood at the pen for a while, watching them the way a man watches something he is quietly grateful for. Then he got the wheelbarrow. He turned fresh straw into the old garden first, working it deep into the soil that had been dead for years and was now dark and living and soft enough to sink a finger into without resistance. He moved slow and even, no wasted motion, the way a man works when he is not performing for anyone. When the old plot was done, he opened the gate to the new one and stood at its edge in the fading light. The soil there was pale and packed, thin, familiar. He almost smiled. He pushed the wheelbarrow through and began. No one came to watch. No one came to apologize or ask forgiveness or offer a word about how they had been wrong. He had not waited for any of that, and he did not need it now. The farm was growing. That was the only thing left to say.